My heart sank as I heard my grandfather's lawyer say those devastating words. And to my granddaughter Elizabeth Patterson, nothing. The room fell silent. My cousin Blake smirked from across the mahogany table, knowing exactly what he'd done. 3 months earlier, my beloved grandfather had promised me his cherished lakeside cabin, the place where I'd spent every summer growing up, learning to fish and hearing his stories under starlit skies. Now I sat stunned in the attorney's office, betrayed not just by the will's contents, but by my own family. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. What my cousin Blake didn't know was that I had discovered the truth about his elaborate lie, and I had proof. As the lawyer continued reading, I clutched the small leather journal in my pocket, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal what really happened that snowy night in December. This is the story of how I lost my inheritance, uncovered a painful deception, and learned that some family bonds aren't worth saving. Growing up in Lakewood, Michigan, the highlight of every summer was spending 2 full months at my grandfather Howard Patterson's cabin on Lake Charlevoix. My parents would drop me off the day after school ended and pick me up just before it started again. Some people might think spending your entire summer with your grandfather would be boring, but Grandpa Howard was anything but ordinary. "Come on, Lizzie," he'd call out at 5 a.m., already dressed in his worn fishing vest and lucky cap. "The bass won't catch themselves." I'd drag myself out of bed, eyes half closed, and stumble into the small wooden boat that had been in our family for 3 generations. By the time the sun fully emerged over the tree line, we'd have caught enough fish for breakfast and dinner. Grandpa wasn't just a fisherman. He was a master storyteller. Each fish we caught had its own tale, each fallen tree its own history. He'd been a history professor at the University of Michigan before retiring, and he brought that same passion for narrative to everything he did. "You see that old oak by the water's edge?" he'd ask, pointing toward a massive tree that seemed to bend protectively over the lake. "Your grandmother Mary and I carved our initials there the day I proposed. 47 years together, and she never once complained about my snoring." His eyes would crinkle at the corners when he spoke about Grandma, who had passed away 5 years earlier. My cousin Blake only visited occasionally. Uncle Richard, Grandpa's younger son and Blake's father, had moved to California for a tech job when Blake was just a toddler. Unlike me, Blake never seemed to connect with the cabin or with Grandpa. He'd spend his visits glued to whatever electronic device he'd brought along, complaining about the spotty cell service and mosquitoes. "That boy needs to learn the value of disconnecting," Grandpa would mutter, but he never pushed Blake too hard. "Different strokes for different folks, Lizzie," he'd tell me with a shrug. "Not everyone feels the trees in their blood like we do." I turned 25 last year, finished my master's degree in environmental science, and landed a job with a conservation nonprofit in Detroit. Life was busy, but I still made time for regular visits to the cabin. Grandpa was 82 now, still spry but showing his age in subtle ways, taking longer to climb the dock steps, napping more frequently in his favorite porch rocker. During my Christmas visit last year, while we sat by the fireplace drinking his famous hot chocolate with a dash of cinnamon, Grandpa brought up the future of the cabin. "Lizzie," he said, his voice more serious than usual, "I'm not going to be around forever." "Don't talk like that," I protested, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that appeared whenever I contemplated life without him. "It's just reality, sweetheart. And when I'm gone, I want you to have this place." I nearly spilled my hot chocolate. "The cabin? But what about Dad and Uncle Richard?" He waved his hand dismissively. "Your father has your mother's family cottage on Lake Michigan, and Richard—" He sighed. "Richard hasn't shown any interest in this place since he left for California. He'd probably sell it to developers the minute the deed was in his hands." "And Blake?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Grandpa chuckled. "That boy thinks roughing it means a hotel without room service. No, this place needs someone who understands its soul, someone who'll preserve it. I felt both honored and overwhelmed. The cabin wasn't just a property, it was our family's history, the setting for 4 generations of Patterson memories. I've already spoken to my lawyer, Martin Chambers. We're updating my will next month, Grandpa continued, reaching for the plate of gingerbread cookies I'd baked earlier. The cabin, the boat, and about 10 acres of land will be yours. I hugged him tightly, promising to honor his legacy and keep the property in the family. That night, as snow fell softly outside, creating a postcard-perfect winter scene across the frozen lake, I couldn't sleep. I imagined future summers bringing my own children here someday, teaching them to fish just as Grandpa had taught me. What I didn't know then was that Blake had arrived unexpectedly that night, letting himself in with the spare key Uncle Richard still had. He'd overheard our entire conversation from the hallway. The next morning, I found Blake making coffee in the kitchen, his presence a surprise. "Blake!" "I didn't know you were coming for Christmas," I said, still in my flannel pajamas and wool socks. He flashed that trademark smile that had apparently gotten him through many sticky situations in life. At 27, Blake had the kind of charisma that made people overlook his less admirable qualities. He'd bounced between jobs, pharmaceutical, sales, real estate, startup ventures that never quite started up, but somehow always landed on his feet. "Last-minute decision," he replied with a shrug. "Dad's on a business trip to Tokyo and Mom's at some spa retreat. Figured I'd surprise the old man." He glanced around the rustic kitchen with its 1970s appliances and handmade wooden cabinets. "This place is like a time capsule, isn't it?" Something in his tone made me uneasy. It wasn't appreciation, it was assessment, like he was mentally calculating property values. Grandpa was delighted to see Blake, of course. Family was everything. To him, and despite Blake's infrequent visits, he was still Howard Patterson's grandson. "My boy!" Grandpa exclaimed, embracing Blake when he came downstairs. "What a wonderful Christmas surprise." Blake spent the next 3 days showing unprecedented interest in the cabin and in Grandpa's stories. He asked questions about the property, boundaries, listened attentively to tales he'd ignored for years, and even joined us for a frigid winter fishing expedition on the partially frozen lake. I should have been pleased by this apparent change of heart, but something felt off. "You're really into all this suddenly," I remarked as we collected firewood together on the second evening. Blake adjusted his designer gloves, clearly unsuited for the task. "Just realizing what's important, family legacy and all that." I nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to start conflict during the holidays. I returned to Detroit after New Year's, busy with work and life. My calls with Grandpa continued. Weekly as always, but something had shifted. He seemed more reserved, less forthcoming about day-to-day happenings at the cabin. When I asked directly if everything was okay, he'd quickly change the subject. "Just winter blues, Lizzie. Nothing to worry about." In February, I took a week off to visit, concerned about the change in our conversations. The cabin looked the same, snow-covered roof, smoke curling from the chimney. But Grandpa wasn't waiting. On the porch as usual. I found him inside, staring pensively at old photo albums. "There's my girl," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. I settled in beside him, noting how much weight he seemed to have lost since Christmas. His flannel shirt hung loosely on his frame. "Grandpa, are you feeling all right? Have you been to the doctor recently?" He patted my hand. "I'm fine, just getting old. Dr. Haynes says everything looks normal for a man my age." We fell into our comfortable routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't identify. On my third night there, after we'd finished dinner, Grandpa cleared his throat in that deliberate way that signaled a serious conversation was coming. "Lizzie, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course," I replied, instantly anxious. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together on the table. Did you approach Martin Chambers about changing my will? Did you ask him to make sure you got the cabin? I felt like I'd been doused with ice water. What? No, absolutely not. Why would you think that? Grandpa's eyes searched mine, looking for truth or deception. Blake visited again in January. He told me he overheard you on the phone with Martin, insisting that I wasn't of sound mind anymore and that the cabin should be put in your name immediately. My mouth fell open in shock. That's completely false. I've never spoken to your lawyer in my life. I don't even have his number. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Blake said you were worried I might change my mind about the inheritance. That you wanted to lock it down before I could reconsider. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Grandpa, that's absurd. Blake is lying to you. His expression hardened slightly. He showed me the text messages, Lizzie, from your number to his, talking about how you planned to convince Martin that I was becoming senile. My blood ran cold. What text messages? I haven't texted Blake in months, and I would never say anything like that. But doubt had already taken root. I could see it in the way Grandpa averted his eyes, in the slight withdrawal of his usual warmth. Blake had somehow fabricated evidence, probably using some app to create fake text conversations, and Grandpa, who still used a flip phone and thought the cloud was something in the sky, had no way of understanding how easily digital evidence could be manipulated. Grandpa, please, I implored, kneeling next to his chair and taking his hands in mine. You know me. You've known me my entire life. Would I ever do something so underhanded? Would I ever talk about you that way? His eyes softened momentarily, but then he pulled his hands away. People change when inheritance is involved. I've seen it happen in other families. Not me, I insisted, tears forming. Never me. The rest of my visit was strained. Grandpa was polite but distant, and my attempts to clear my name only seemed to entrench his suspicions. I returned to Detroit devastated, immediately calling my father to explain the situation. Blake did what? Dad exploded after hearing my story. I'm calling Richard right now. But Uncle Richard, always protective of his only son, insisted there must be a misunderstanding. Blake wouldn't make up stories, Jim. He's a grown man with a successful career. What would he have to gain? About 10 acres of prime lakefront property, my father retorted before hanging up. Over the next few weeks, I tried repeatedly to reach Grandpa, but our conversations remained superficial. He wouldn't discuss Blake's accusations or the will. Again. I sent handwritten letters, knowing he appreciated the gesture more than emails or texts, pleading my innocence and expressing my hurt at being disbelieved. In March, my father called with disturbing news. Dad's changed his will, he said without preamble. Martin Chambers reached out to give me a heads up. My stomach dropped. He believed Blake's lies. Apparently, the cabin is now going to be split between you and Blake, with Blake getting controlling interest. Martin tried to talk him out of it, said it seemed like a sudden decision, but Dad was adamant. I sat heavily on my couch, trying to process this betrayal. Did Martin tell him that I've never contacted his office? He did, but Dad said the evidence was irrefutable. Whatever Blake showed him, he's completely convinced. April brought more heartache. Grandpa was hospitalized with pneumonia, and though he recovered, the illness left him notably weaker. I visited him in the hospital despite his coolness toward me, bringing his favorite homemade chicken soup and the mystery novel he'd been reading. I don't believe what Blake told you, I said quietly as I was leaving. And it hurts that you could think I'd do something like that. But I love you no matter what, and that will never change. He didn't respond, just nodded slightly and closed his eyes. In May, things took an even worse turn. My father called again, his voice tight with anger. The will's been changed again. Blake visited Dad at the rehabilitation center after his hospital. Stay, I braced myself. And? You've been completely written out. The cabin, the land, everything is going to Blake now. The injustice was staggering. Based on complete lies. Dad, can't we contest this? Martin is concerned too. He said Dad was particularly weak that day, and Blake was in the room during the entire meeting. But legally, as long as Dad is deemed competent, his wishes stand. I felt physically ill. Not just because of the inheritance, though the thought of Blake selling the cabin to developers made me sick, but because Grandpa would die believing I had betrayed him, that his beloved granddaughter had tried to manipulate him and take advantage of his age. June arrived, and with it, unexpected news from an unlikely source. Emily Winters, Grandpa's home health aide who visited 3 times weekly since his hospitalization, called me out of the blue. Elizabeth, I hope you don't mind me contacting you. Your grandfather mentioned you, and I found your number in his address book. Is he okay? I asked immediately. Physically, he's stable. But there's something you should know. I've overheard your cousin Blake on the phone several times when he thought no one was listening. He was talking about selling the cabin property to someone named Davidson as soon as the will clears probate. My suspicions confirmed. I thanked Emily for the information. Has my grandfather mentioned the will to me recently? She hesitated. He keeps a journal. Sometimes when I help him to bed, I see him writing in it. Once I glimpsed your name. This gave me a flicker of hope. Grandpa had kept journals for decades, documenting everything from weather patterns to family visits. Emily, this is a lot to ask, but is there any way you could look at that journal? Just to see if he's written anything about Blake's accusations? I couldn't do that, she said firmly. It would violate his privacy and my professional ethics. I respected her integrity while feeling desperate for any evidence that might clear my name. A week later, Emily called again. Your grandfather had a bad fall. He's back in the hospital. They don't think... Her voice broke. They're saying it might be just days. I drove to Lakewood immediately, my heart pounding with grief and anxiety. At the hospital, I found Blake already there, playing the role of devoted grandson to the nursing staff. He barely acknowledged me when I entered Grandpa's room. Grandpa looked so small in the hospital bed, connected to monitors and oxygen. His eyes fluttered open when I took his hand. Lizzie, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm here, Grandpa, I said, tears streaming down my face. I'm right here. He drifted in and out of consciousness over the next few hours. During one lucid moment, when Blake had stepped out to take a call, Grandpa squeezed my hand weakly. My journal, he murmured. Cabin bookshelf, I leaned closer. Your journal? On the bookshelf at the cabin? He nodded almost imperceptibly before closing his eyes again. When Blake returned, I made an excuse about needing coffee and slipped out. Instead of heading to the cafeteria, I drove straight to the cabin, my mind racing. What was in the journal? That Grandpa wanted me to find? The cabin was quiet and musty from being closed up. I went directly to the built-in bookshelf beside the fireplace, where Grandpa kept his current journal. But it wasn't in its usual spot. I searched frantically, checking drawers, cabinets, even under his mattress. Finally, behind a loose board, in his bedroom closet, a hiding place he'd shown me years ago when I was a child, where he kept special treasures, I found it. A small leather-bound journal, newer than his usual ones. My hands trembled as I opened it, feeling like I was violating his privacy despite his apparent instruction to find it. The first entry was dated January 10th, just after my Christmas visit, Blake. Surprised me by returning today after Lizzie left. He's showing such interest in the cabin lately. Said he's realized how important family legacy is. I'm touched, though skeptical. Never seen the boy fish voluntarily before. I flipped through entries about his daily routines, health concerns, and memories of Grandma until I reached January 28th. The handwriting was more agitated here. Blake showed me disturbing text messages today from Lizzie to him. In them, she discusses going behind my back to Martin, claiming I'm becoming senile to get the cabin put in her name immediately. I can't believe my Lizzie would do this. It doesn't sound like her at all. The timestamps on the messages are from when she was here at Christmas. But she was with me most of that time, not on her phone. Something doesn't add up. My heart raced as I turned the page. February 15th. Lizzie visited. She denied everything, of course, seemed genuinely shocked. I've known that girl her whole life, watched her grow into a woman of integrity. Could Blake have fabricated those messages? But why would he lie about something so serious? March 3rd. Changed my will today. Split the cabin between Lizzie and Blake. I'm still uncertain about the truth. If Lizzie is innocent, I'm doing her a grave injustice. But if Blake is lying, I'm rewarding deceit. God help me make sense of this. April entries detailed his illness and hospitalization. Then, May 12th. Blake visited today at the rehab center. Pressured me to change the will again, to leave everything to him. Said he'd found more evidence of Lizzie's betrayal. I was too weak to argue. Martin seemed concerned, but followed my instructions. I fear I've made a terrible mistake. The final entry, dated just 1 week ago, made me gasp. Emily brought my mail today. Among the bills was a small package addressed to me. Inside was a USB drive and an anonymous note saying, "The truth about your grandson." I asked Emily to help me view it on her tablet. It contained a video of Blake in what appeared to be a hotel room, speaking to someone off camera about his foolproof plan to get the cabin. He mentioned using an app to create fake text messages from Lizzie's number. Said the old man is gullible and won't know tech from Shinola. I've been a fool. My Lizzie would never betray me. I've called Martin to change the will back immediately, but he's on vacation until next week. If anything happens to me before then... God forgive me for doubting her. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the journal to my chest. Grandpa had discovered the truth, but possibly too late. I needed to find that USB drive. It had to be here somewhere. As I began searching again, I heard the cabin door open. Heavy footsteps crossed the living room floor. "Looking for something, cousin?" Blake's voice was cold, calculating. He stood in the bedroom doorway, eyes fixed on the journal in my hands. I straightened up, no longer afraid but filled with righteous anger. How could you do this to him? To me? Blake stepped closer, his handsome face twisted into something ugly. This place is worth millions to developers. Do you have any idea what Davison Resorts offered me just for a preliminary agreement? You'd have kept it as some kind of shrine to the old man, fishing in that stupid little boat for the next 50 years. He loved you, I said, backing away, still clutching the journal. Despite everything, you were still his grandson. And you were always the favorite, he sneered. Perfect Lizzie, who loved the same boring things he did, who hung on his every word like he was some kind of oracle. Where's the USB drive, Blake? The one that shows you planning all this? A flicker of panic crossed his face. What are you talking about? Grandpa found it. He wrote about it right here. I tapped the journal. Someone sent him video evidence of you confessing your entire scheme. Blake lunged for the journal, but I was quicker, dodging around him and running for the door. Grandpa already called. His lawyer to change the will back, I called over my shoulder. It's over, Blake. I made it to my car, locking the doors as Blake pounded on the window. You're lying. He couldn't have known. Give me that journal. I started the engine and peeled away, heart hammering in my chest. At the hospital, I found Grandpa awake, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. You found it, he whispered as I showed him the journal. I did. And Blake knows I know. I held his frail hand. But where's the USB drive, Grandpa? We need that evidence. A ghost of his old smile appeared. Safety deposit box. Key in my wallet. Emily has it. I kissed his forehead gently. Rest now. Everything's going to be okay. 2 days later, Howard Patterson passed away peacefully in his sleep. I was at his bedside, holding his hand and telling him stories about our summers together, just as he'd always told me stories. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week at Martin Chambers' office in downtown Lakewood. I sat nervously, the journal hidden in my bag, waiting for Blake and Uncle Richard to arrive. Martin looked grave as he shuffled his papers, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to read. As you know, he began once everyone was seated, Howard made several changes to his will in recent months. The most recent document, which I'm legally bound to execute, leaves the cabin property entirely to Blake Patterson. Blake couldn't hide his triumphant smile. Uncle Richard looked pleased but confused, while my father placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. However, Martin continued, I received a call from Howard last week, instructing me to make yet another change. Due to my vacation, we scheduled the signing for what would have been tomorrow. Since he passed before executing this final version, legally we must follow the last signed document. Blake's smile widened, and I felt a moment of despair. But then Martin added, that said, Howard also recorded a video statement with me yesterday morning, which he asked to be played at this reading regardless of the legal status of the will. With your permission, I'll play it now. He turned his computer monitor toward us and pressed play. Grandpa appeared on screen, propped up in his hospital bed but clear-eyed and determined. If you're watching this, he began, his voice stronger than it had been in person. Then I've passed on before making things right. I made a terrible mistake in believing lies about my granddaughter Elizabeth. Blake fabricated evidence to convince me that Lizzie was trying to manipulate me, when in fact it was Blake himself who was doing the manipulating. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his smile fading. I received anonymous video evidence proving Blake's deception, which is now in my safety deposit box at Lakewood Community Bank. The key is with my home health aide, Emily Winters. Elizabeth also has my personal journal documenting my discovery of the truth. Grandpa looked directly into the camera. His blue eyes, so like my own, full of regret and love. Lizzie, I'm so sorry I doubted you. I hope you can forgive an old man's foolishness. The cabin is yours, as it always should have been. Blake, I still love you, but I cannot reward such calculated deceit. Martin has instructions for a small trust fund for you, with the condition that you seek counseling. Richard and Jim, please remember that family is more precious than property. Don't let this divide you further. His voice faltered slightly. And Lizzie, remember our summers. Remember the stories. The cabin has more to tell you if you listen closely enough. The video ended, and the room fell into stunned silence. Blake stood abruptly, his face contorted with rage. This is bull. Blake. Uncle Richard's voice cut through his son's protest. Sit down, now. To everyone's surprise, Uncle Richard turned to me, his expression somber. Elizabeth, I owe you an apology. I should have questioned Blake's story more thoroughly. Blake stared at his father in disbelief. Dad, you can't be serious. She obviously manipulated Grandpa when he was dying. Martin cleared his throat. Actually, Blake Howard was deemed fully competent by his doctors when he recorded this statement. And while the most recent signed will does leave you the property, this video would provide compelling evidence in any contestation. My father leaned forward. Which is exactly what we'll do if necessary. Blake looked from face to face, seeking an ally and finding none. Even his father had turned away, examining his hands with newfound shame. I opened my bag and removed Grandpa's journal, placing it on the table. The truth is all here, in his own words. Plus, whatever's on that USB drive in his safety deposit box. The fight seemed to drain out of Blake as he realized his carefully constructed plan had unraveled completely. He stood again, more slowly, this time. This isn't over, he muttered. But the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. As Blake stormed out, with Uncle Richard following after an apologetic glance in my direction, I felt no victory, only profound sadness. A family fractured, trust broken, all over property and greed. Martin closed his folder. I'll start the paperwork to contest the current will based on this new evidence. With the video testimony and journal, I believe we have a strong case. My father nodded. Thank you, Martin, for everything. As we left the office, stepping into the warm June sunshine, Dad put his arm around my shoulders. Your grandfather loved you very much, Lizzie. He knew the truth when it mattered. I leaned into his embrace, the leather journal still clutched. In my hands. I know. And I'm going to honor his legacy exactly as he wanted. That evening, I drove to the cabin alone, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. On the porch swing where Grandpa and I had spent countless evenings, I finally allowed myself to fully grieve, for him, for the broken family bonds, and for the innocence lost. But as dusk settled over the water and the first stars appeared above the tree line, I felt a sense of peace gradually replacing the pain. Grandpa had discovered the truth. He hadn't died believing the worst of me, and somehow that meant everything. I'll take care of this place, Grandpa, I whispered to the twilight breeze rustling through the pines. I promise. From somewhere in the gathering darkness came the call of a loon. Lonely but beautiful, echoing across the water just as it had every summer of my life. In that mournful, familiar sound, I found both an ending and a beginning. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's east-facing windows. Grandpa's deliberate design choice to greet each day properly, as he'd always said. For a moment, I could almost believe he was downstairs preparing coffee, ready to suggest a morning fishing expedition. Reality settled in slowly as I made my way to the kitchen. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore and occasional bird song. I made coffee in the ancient percolator Grandpa refused to replace, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. Emily had texted that she would meet me at the bank at noon with Grandpa's wallet containing the safety deposit box key. Until then, I decided to properly inspect the cabin, now potentially mine, with fresh eyes. The main structure dated back to 1962, when Grandpa and his brother, Uncle Richard's father, had built it themselves. Additions came later. The sunroom where Grandma Mary used to read, the expanded kitchen after their children were born, the second bathroom added in the 1990s when teenage cousins made privacy a necessity. In Grandpa's bedroom, I noticed something I'd overlooked during my frantic search for the journal. A sealed envelope taped to the back of his framed fishing license, his first from 1948, proudly displayed despite its yellowed condition. My name was written on it in his distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, I carefully removed and opened it. Lizzie, if you're reading this, things have gone sideways, as they sometimes do in life. I've written several versions of this letter over the years, but this final one is being written after discovering Blake's deception. First, I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for doubting you. A grandfather should know his own granddaughters. Character better than to be swayed by manufactured evidence. My only excuse is that age sometimes brings fear. Fear of being taken advantage of, fear of losing control, fear of making the wrong choice for the legacy I leave behind. Second, there's something in the cabin you should know about. The northeast corner of the basement behind the old water heater has a false wall. Your grandmother and I created a small hidden space there during the Cold War. Seems silly now, but we were young and the world seemed dangerous. Inside, you'll find a metal box containing some items I've saved for you. Your grandmother's wedding ring and journals, some family photographs too precious for albums, and documents about the cabin's history and surrounding land. Third, and most importantly, never forget that people are more important than possessions. The cabin is just wood and nails without the memories we create in it. Blake's actions have revealed a darkness in him that breaks my heart, but I still hope that someday he'll find his way back to what truly matters. I'll miss our sunrise fishing trips, our evening stories on the porch, and watching you grow into the remarkable woman you've become. Take care of our special place, Lizzie. It belongs to you now in every way that matters. All my love, Grandpa Howard P.S. Check the loose floorboard under the braided rug in the living room. There's something there I've been saving for a special occasion. Consider this occasion. Tears streamed down my face as I carefully folded the letter. The forgiveness and love it contained were overwhelming, especially knowing he'd written it after discovering Blake's betrayal. Even then, he'd expressed hope for Blake's redemption. I immediately went to the living room and rolled back the braided rug Grandma had made decades ago. The loose floorboard was easy to spot, slightly warped compared to its neighbors. Lifting, it revealed a dusty wooden box about the size of a thick hardcover book. Inside lay a bottle of 30-year-old scotch, Grandpa's favorite special occasion drink, and 2 crystal tumblers wrapped in soft cloth. A small note simply read, "For celebrations and remembrances, use wisely." The basement discovery would have to wait. I checked my watch and realized it was time to meet Emily at the bank. Carefully rewrapping the scotch and replacing it, I grabbed my keys and headed out. Lakewood Community Bank still had the same faded carpet and wood-paneled walls I remembered from childhood trips with Grandpa to deposit my birthday checks. The manager, Mrs. Hendricks, recognized me immediately. "Elizabeth, I was so sorry to hear about Howard. He was a fixture in this community." "Thank you," I managed, the brief drive having given me time to compose myself after finding the letter. Emily arrived moments later, Grandpa's worn leather wallet in hand. "The doctors gave me his personal effects after he passed," she explained. "I knew this was important." Together, we followed Mrs. Hendricks to the safety deposit vault. The box itself was small, one of the bank's medium-sized options. Inside was exactly what we expected, a USB drive in a protective case labeled simply "Truth" in Grandpa's handwriting. "Do you have somewhere we could view this?" I asked Mrs. Hendricks, who nodded sympathetically. "You can use our conference room." Complete privacy. Emily squeezed my hand. "Would you like me to stay?" "I've already seen it, but please," I interrupted. "I could use the support." The bank's conference room was small but comfortably appointed. Mrs. Hendricks connected the USB drive to a monitor on the wall and discreetly left us alone. Emily used the remote to start the video file. The footage was clearly taken surreptitiously in what appeared to be a hotel room. Blake sat on the edge of a bed, speaking to someone, off camera. I immediately recognized the setting as the Lakewood Inn, the town's only hotel, where Blake typically stayed during his visits rather than at the cabin. "It's working perfectly," Blake was saying, smiling smugly. "The old man totally bought those. Fake texts. You should have seen his face, like someone had punched him in the gut," a female voice responded from off camera. "You're sure he won't check with Elizabeth directly?" Blake laughed. "That's the beauty of it. When he confronts her, she'll obviously deny it, which just makes her look more guilty. It's her word against evidence." "And your dad? Won't he be suspicious?" Blake's expression hardened. "Dad barely talks to Grandpa anymore. Besides, all he cares about is that the property stays in the family somehow. He has no emotional attachment to the place." "So when do you close the deal with Davidson?" "As soon as the will clears probate. Their lawyers already have the preliminary paperwork drawn up. 22 million, Vanessa. Can you believe it? For a rundown cabin and some trees." The woman, Vanessa, moved partially into frame, revealing a blonde in a business suit. "The location is prime lakefront. Davidson Resorts has been trying to get property on that stretch for years. Millionaires want luxury vacation homes with private lake access." Blake stood, moving to pour himself a drink from the mini bar. "Lizzie would keep it exactly as it is until it rotted away. All those precious memories," he made air quotes, "mean she can't see what a gold mine it is. She'd probably try to turn it into some environmental trust or something equally useless. You don't feel bad manipulating your grandfather like this?" Blake shrugged, his back to the camera. He's 82. How many more years does he realistically have? Besides, I'm his grandson, too. I deserve a piece of the inheritance. The whole inheritance, you mean? Vanessa corrected with a laugh. Exactly. And once Davidson builds their resort, we'll have lifetime VIP status. Imagine spending summers here, but an actual luxury instead of a cabin with unreliable plumbing and mosquitoes. The video continued for several more minutes, detailing their plans and Blake's strategies for continuing to manipulate Grandpa. He mentioned the app he'd used to create the fake text messages and how he'd carefully studied my texting style to make them believable. When it finally ended, I sat in stunned silence, even though none of the revelations were truly surprising after finding Grandpa's journal. Who sent this to him? I finally asked. Emily shook her head. The package had no return address. It was postmarked from Traverse City, about an hour from here. Vanessa, I mused. She must have recorded it secretly and had an attack of conscience. Or they had a falling out, Emily suggested. Either way, it arrived just in time for your grandfather to learn the truth. We thanked Mrs. Hendricks and copied the video file to my phone before returning the USB drive to the safety deposit box. For now, it would remain secure there as potential evidence for the will contestation. Back at the cabin, I remembered the hidden compartment Grandpa had mentioned in his letter. The basement was cool and smelled of earth and old wood, exactly as it had throughout my childhood. The ancient water heater stood like a sentinel in the northeast corner. Behind it, just as Grandpa had described, was a section of wall that looked identical to the rest, except for a nearly invisible seam running from floor to ceiling. Pressing firmly on the right spot caused a section to pop inward slightly, revealing a clever hidden door. The space behind was small, about the size of a coat closet, and contained a single metal lockbox. Unlike the safety deposit box, this one required a combination. I tried Grandpa's birthday. Nothing. Grandma's birthday. Still nothing. Then, on a hunch, I tried the date they had carved their initials into the oak tree, 06-14-58. The lock clicked open. Inside was everything Grandpa had promised. Grandma's delicate gold wedding band and engagement ring nestled in velvet. Her journals bound with faded ribbon. Photographs I'd never seen before showing 5 generations of Pattersons at the lake, dating back to the 1920s. At the bottom lay a thick folder of documents, the original deed to the property, surveys showing the exact boundaries, and something unexpected: mineral rights documentation. According to these papers, when Grandpa had purchased the surrounding 10 acres in the 1970s, he had acquired not just the surface land, but all mineral rights below. A geological survey from 1995, tucked discreetly between property tax records, indicated significant natural gas deposits deep beneath the property. This explained Davidson Resort's intense interest. It wasn't just the lakefront location. They knew about the potential for resource extraction. The resort would be a cover for their real interest, the minerals beneath. I carefully returned everything to the box except the documents, which I brought upstairs to study more carefully. Sitting at Grandpa's old roll-top desk, I spread them out, trying to understand the full implications. My phone rang, interrupting my investigation. It was Martin Chambers. Elizabeth, I've been reviewing the will situation. I believe we have enough evidence to successfully contest the current will and honor your grandfather's final wishes. That's good news, I replied, my mind still processing the mineral rights discovery. There's something else, Martin continued, his tone cautious. Blake and his father are requesting a meeting, tomorrow at my office if you're available. I hesitated, unsure what possible purpose such a meeting could serve. Did they say why? Richard indicated they want to propose a settlement of sorts to avoid a potentially lengthy and public legal battle. The documents laid out before me suddenly took on new significance. Blake and Uncle Richard likely knew nothing about the mineral rights. Their focus was on the resort deal with Davidson. I'll be there, I decided. What time? 11. And Elizabeth? I'd recommend bringing any additional documentation you found about the property, just to be prepared. After hanging up, I called my father to update him on all the developments. The letter from Grandpa, the USB video, the hidden compartment, and the mineral rights discovery. Davidson Resorts, Dad mused. They've been buying up property all around the lake for years. People were wondering why they'd pay so much over market value. Now we know, I replied. Do you think Uncle Richard is aware of the mineral rights? Doubtful. He never took much interest in the property details, and Dad was always private about financial matters. Blake probably has no idea what he's really selling. Should I reveal this tomorrow? Dad was quiet for a moment. Let's see what they're offering first. Knowledge is power, Lizzie. That night, I decided to honor Grandpa properly. I retrieved the scotch from under the floorboard, unwrapped the crystal tumblers, and walked down to the dock where we'd spent so many evenings watching the sunset. I poured a finger of scotch into each glass, setting one at the edge of the dock, Grandpa's favorite spot, and keeping one for myself. The lake was calm, reflecting the first stars of evening like scattered diamonds. To you, Grandpa, I whispered, raising my glass. The scotch burned pleasantly going down, warming me from the inside. I'll make this right. I promise. As if in answer, a loon called across the water, its haunting cry both melancholy and beautiful. I stayed there until full darkness fell, remembering all the stories Grandpa had told me about the lake, the land, and our family history. The next morning it dawned clear and warm. I dressed carefully for the meeting, professionally but not formally, and gathered the mineral rights documents into a folder. Whatever Blake and Uncle Richard were planning, I wanted to be prepared. Martin's office was in a converted Victorian, near the town square. I arrived 15 minutes early, but Blake's expensive sports car was already parked outside. Taking a deep breath, I entered. The conference room atmosphere was tense. Blake sat stiffly beside Uncle Richard, both in business attire that seemed out of place in small-town Lakewood. My father had arrived before me and sat opposite them, his expression carefully neutral. Martin stood when I entered, gesturing to the empty chair beside Dad. Now that we're all here, Martin began after I was seated, Richard has requested this meeting to discuss a potential resolution regarding Howard's estate. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. Elizabeth, first, I want to apologize again. I should have questioned Blake's story more thoroughly. He shot his son with a disappointed glance. What happened was unacceptable. Blake stared at the table, his usual confidence notably absent. However, Uncle Richard continued, contesting the will could take months, even years. It would be expensive, public, and frankly, would damage our family further. What exactly are you proposing? My father asked. A compromise. Blake will renounce any claim to the cabin and the immediate surrounding acre, the part with sentimental value. In exchange, Elizabeth agrees not to contest the will regarding the remaining 9 acres of undeveloped land, which would go to Blake as specified in the current will. The strategy was immediately clear. They wanted to salvage Blake's deal with Davidson Resorts. The cabin itself was worthless to them. It was the land and what lay beneath it that had value. That's very generous, I said carefully, considering Grandpa's video testimony makes it clear that the entire property was meant to be mine. Video testimony from a man in his final days. Blake spoke up for the first time, his tone suggesting dubious validity. Potentially influenced or confused, Blake, Uncle Richard warned sharply. Martin interjected. As Howard's lawyer for over 30 years, I can attest that he was of sound mind when recording that statement. The cabin itself is what matters. To you, right, Lizzie? Blake asked, attempting a conciliatory tone. The place where all your precious memories were made. We're offering you that, free and clear. I opened my folder and carefully laid out the mineral rights documentation on the table. Actually, I think there's something you should see before we discuss this further. Uncle Richard leaned forward, adjusting his glasses to examine the papers. Blake remained still, confusion crossing his face. "What are those?" he asked. "Geological surveys and mineral rights documentation," my father explained. "It seems the property has significant natural gas deposits, which I suspect is why Davidson Resorts is so interested in that worthless, undeveloped land." The color drained from Blake's face. Uncle Richard picked up the survey, studying it intently. "I had no idea," he murmured. "Neither did I, until yesterday," I admitted. "Grandpa left these documents in a hidden compartment in the basement. I don't think he fully understood their significance either." Blake shot up from his chair. "This doesn't change anything legally. The current will sits on very shaky ground." Martin finished for him. "Given the video evidence of your deliberate deception, plus Howard's journal and his recorded intent to change the will back, any judge would likely rule in Elizabeth's favor." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Blake slowly sank back into his chair, defeated. Uncle Richard finally spoke. "Lizzie, what do you want? Truly?" I considered the question carefully. "I want what Grandpa wanted, for the cabin and land to stay in the family, preserved rather than developed. I want his legacy honored." "And the mineral rights?" Blake asked bitterly. "Should benefit the family as a whole, not just one person," I replied firmly. "If they're as valuable as this survey suggests, there's enough for everyone, but extracted responsibly, with minimal environmental impact." I looked directly at Uncle Richard. "Grandpa told me once that different people feel the connection to this place differently. He never expected everyone to love fishing at dawn or telling stories on the porch. But he did expect us all to respect what it meant to him and to our family history." Uncle Richard nodded slowly, removing his glasses, to rub his eyes. He was right. I lost sight of that over the years. The meeting continued for another hour as we hammered out details. By the end, we had agreed to a family trust arrangement. The cabin and all the land would legally remain intact, with me as the primary trustee. Any future mineral rights income would be shared among family members, with a percentage reserved for conservation of the lake and surrounding wilderness. Blake left as soon as the agreement was outlined, still angry but powerless to object, given the evidence against him. Uncle Richard lingered, examining old photographs of the cabin that Martin had on file from previous property assessments. "I haven't been there in almost 10 years, he admitted. "Too busy with work," I told myself. "You should visit," I suggested. "There's plenty of room," he smiled sadly. "Maybe I will, after all this is settled." As we left Martin's office, the summer sun high overhead, I felt a weight lifting. The cabin, Grandpa's legacy, was secure. The family might be fractured, but perhaps not beyond repair. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching fireflies begin their nightly dance over the lake, I opened Grandma's journals for the first time. Her elegant handwriting filled the pages with observations about family visits, weather patterns, wildlife sightings, and occasional profound reflections on life at the lake. One passage from 1975 caught my attention. "Howard worries too much about what will happen to this place after we're gone. I told him today that we've done our part. We've created something beautiful and filled it with love. What happens next isn't entirely in our hands. We can only trust that we've passed on what matters most, not the property itself, but the understanding of why it matters." I closed the journal, smiling through tears. Grandma Mary had been right, of course. And in the end, so had Grandpa. The cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was the repository of our family's heart. Now it was my turn to be its caretaker, to preserve what mattered while allowing it to evolve for future generations. The loon called again from across the darkening water, its voice carrying easily in the evening stillness. I raised my glass of scotch in silent toast, knowing that somewhere Grandpa was fishing in perfect waters, Grandma by his side, both of them finally at peace. 1 month after the meeting in Martin's office, I stood on the cabin's porch watching a summer storm roll across the lake. Lightning illuminated the churning water in brief, dramatic flashes while thunder rumbled overhead. Grandpa had loved these storms. Nature's fireworks, he called them. The cabin felt different now, not just because Grandpa was gone, but because I viewed it through new eyes, not merely as a beloved retreat, but as a responsibility. The family trust paperwork had been finalized the previous week, making me the official primary trustee of the Patterson Lake Property Trust. My phone chimed with a text from Dad. Meeting with environmental consultants confirmed for next Tuesday. Davidson Resorts sent another offer, double their previous one. Told them property not for sale at any price. I smiled, typing back a quick thank you. Davidson had been persistent, sending increasingly generous offers despite our clear refusal to sell. They'd even attempted to approach Blake directly, unaware that the new legal arrangement required unanimous trustee approval for any sale. My conservation work had prepared me well for managing the mineral rights issue. The environmental consultants Dad mentioned were specialists in minimally invasive extraction methods, if we decided to proceed at all. Any decisions would be based on thorough impact studies and sustainable practices. The rain began in earnest, drumming on the roof in that familiar, comforting rhythm. I went inside and lit a fire in the stone fireplace, curling up in Grandpa's old leather armchair with one of Grandma's journals. A knock at the door startled me. Who would be visiting during a storm like this? Through the window, I spotted a familiar car, Uncle Richard's sedan. Surprised, I opened the door to find him standing on the porch, soaking wet despite his umbrella. "Richard, come in. You're drenched." Stepped inside, folding his umbrella and looking around with an expression of wonder. "It's exactly the same," he murmured. "After all these years." "Not exactly," I said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "The refrigerator finally died last week. Had to get a new one." He laughed, removing his wet jacket. "Dad would have kept repairing that thing until the end of time." He tried. The repair guy finally refused to come back, said it belonged in a museum, not a kitchen. I made coffee while Uncle Richard warmed himself by the fire. He seemed hesitant, almost nervous, running his fingers along the mantelpiece where photos of various family members through the years were displayed. "I didn't call first," he said apologetically. "I was driving up to Traverse City for a business meeting and just took the turnoff. Impulse decision." "You're always welcome here," I assured him, handing him a steaming mug. "That was the agreement, remember? Family access continues as always." He nodded, his gaze landing on a photo of himself as a teenager, holding up a large vase beside a young Howard Patterson. "I used to love fishing with Dad. Did you know that?" "Grandpa mentioned it sometimes. Said you had a knack for it." Richard smiled sadly. "I did. Patience," he said. "I could sit for hours." He sighed. "Somewhere along the way, I lost that patience. Life became all about the next deal, the next promotion. California seemed like such an opportunity. It was, wasn't it? You've been very successful. Financially, yes." He sat heavily in the chair opposite me. "In other ways, I'm not so sure anymore." Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows. We sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the crackling fire and the weather's fury. "Blake won't speak to me," Richard finally said. "He's furious about the trust arrangement. Says I betrayed him." I set down Grandma's journal. "I'm sorry. That must be difficult." "It is, but necessary." He met my eyes directly. "He needs to face consequences for what he did. The trust arrangement is more than fair, generous even, but he can't see past not getting everything he wanted." Has he gone back to California? Richard shook his head. He's still in Chicago. The Davis firm offered him a position in their acquisitions department. A pause. Away from me. The pain in his voice was evident. Despite everything, Blake was still his son. Give him time, I suggested gently. This whole situation forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. You're being remarkably understanding considering what he tried to do to you. I thought about this for a moment. Grandpa's letter helped. He reminded me that people are more important than possessions, even when those people hurt you. Richard nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I found this when cleaning out my desk last week. I'd forgotten I had it. He handed me the box. Inside was a delicate silver charm bracelet with a single charm, a tiny silver fish. Dad gave this to my mother when they first started dating, Richard explained. She added charms throughout their marriage, significant moments, anniversaries. When she died, Dad gave it to Ellen for safekeeping, thinking a woman would appreciate it more. After our divorce, Ellen returned it to me. I meant to give it to you years ago, but life got in the way, I finished for him. Yes. He gestured to the bracelet. It belongs here, with the cabin, with you. I carefully lifted it from the box, admiring the craftsmanship of the single fish charm. Thank you. I'll treasure it. Richard stayed for dinner, a simple meal of pasta and salad, all I had on hand, and we talked more than we had in years. He shared stories about his childhood at the cabin, perspectives on Grandpa that I'd never heard before. In turn, I told him about my conservation work and preliminary plans for the property. As the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a fresh, rain-washed evening, Richard prepared to leave. Next time, bring Vanessa, I suggested as we walked to his car. He stopped abruptly. Vanessa? The woman from the video. Blake's? I hesitated, unsure of the proper term. Accomplice? Richard's confusion was evident. Elizabeth, I don't know any Vanessa. Now it was my turn to be confused. Blonde? Business suit? She was with Blake in the hotel room when the video was recorded. Richard shook his head slowly. I've never heard Blake mention anyone named Vanessa. Are you sure about the name? That's what Blake called her in the video. She seemed to be involved. In the Davidson Resorts deal somehow. Richard frowned thoughtfully. I'll look into it. There's something off about this whole Davidson situation. He checked his watch. I need to get on the road if I'm going to make my meeting, but I'll call you tomorrow. After he left, I returned to the porch, troubled by this new mystery. Who was Vanessa, and why didn't Richard know about her? The night was clear now, stars emerging brilliantly overhead. A nearly full moon cast silver light across the lake's surface. My phone rang. Martin Chambers. Elizabeth, sorry to call so late. I've been reviewing some paperwork related to Davidson Resorts and found something concerning. Do you know if your grandfather ever had contact with them before his hospitalization? Not that I'm aware of. Why? There's a letter in his file dated January of this year, purportedly from Howard, expressing interest in selling the property to Davidson. The signature looks genuine, but the content doesn't align with anything Howard ever said to me about his intentions for the cabin. My earlier unease intensified. Grandpa would never have considered selling. Ever. That's what I thought. I'm going to have the signature analyzed. In the meantime, I suggest you check your grandfather's papers for any correspondence with Davidson or mention of them. After hanging up, I immediately went to Grandpa's roll-top desk where he kept his personal correspondence. Nothing about Davidson appeared in any recent letters. I moved on to his file cabinet, methodically working through folders labeled by year. In the 2023 file, I found something unexpected. A brochure for Davidson Resorts, showing luxurious vacation homes and a planned lakefront community. Handwritten notes in the margins read, called 315, not interested, and persistent, called again 522, told them firmly no. So Davidson had approached Grandpa directly, well before Blake's scheme began. This wasn't just opportunistic, it was targeted. I turned to the computer Grandpa had reluctantly started using in his final years, primarily for email and the occasional online shopping. His password was predictable, Mary Lizzie 1948, combining Grandma's name, my nickname, and their wedding year. His email inbox contained several messages from Davidson Resorts dating back over 2 years. The most recent, from November of last year, was particularly interesting. Mr. Patterson, following our phone conversation last week, I wanted to clarify Davidson Resorts' position. While we respect your attachment to your property, we believe our offer represents exceptional value for land that will eventually face development pressure regardless of your decision. As discussed, our environmental impact studies show minimal disruption to the local ecosystem with our planned approach. The mineral rights aspect need not become public knowledge if handled discreetly. Our initial offer of $8 million stands until the end of this year, after which market conditions may necessitate a reassessment. Regards, Vanessa Caldwell Sr., Acquisition Specialist, Davidson Resorts, Vanessa Caldwell. The same Vanessa from the video. She had been pursuing Grandpa directly before forming an alliance with Blake. But why would she secretly record their conversation and send it to Grandpa? Forwarded the email to myself and Martin, then continued searching. In Grandpa's sent folder, I found his terse reply, Ms. Caldwell. My answer remains unchanged. The Patterson property is not for sale at any price. Please cease contact regarding this matter. Howard Patterson. The final piece clicked into place when I found a notification email from LinkedIn suggesting connections for Grandpa, who had clearly never used the platform. One recommended connection caught my eye, Vanessa Caldwell, who had recently viewed his profile. Her current employer wasn't Davidson Resorts, but Westlake Development, a direct competitor, corporate, espionage. Vanessa had likely approached Blake initially as a Davidson representative, but her true allegiance was to Westlake. The recording was her insurance policy, or her way of sabotaging Davidson's acquisition plans when they grew too close to succeeding. Called Martin immediately despite the late hour and shared my findings. He agreed to expedite the investigation into the allegedly forged letter and contact the appropriate authorities about potential corporate misconduct. Sleep eluded me that night. I sat on the dock until dawn, watching the moon's reflection on the water and contemplating the tangled web of deception surrounding Grandpa's final months. By morning, I had reached a decision about how to proceed. After a quick breakfast, I drove to Lakewood Inn where Blake had been staying since the will reading. The desk clerk confirmed he was still a guest, and when I called his room, he agreed to meet me in the lobby cafe, likely out of curiosity more than goodwill. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, his usual polished appearance. Notably absent, he didn't stand when I approached his table. "Come to gloat?" he asked, stirring his coffee listlessly. "No, I came to show you something." I placed my tablet on the table, displaying Vanessa Caldwell's email to Grandpa. "Your partner wasn't who you thought she was." Blake scanned the email, confusion crossing his face. "What is this supposed to mean?" "Vanessa Caldwell works for Westlake Development, not Davidson. You were being used to sabotage a competitor's deal." His face paled as the implications sank in. "That's not possible." She showed me her Davidson business card, letterhead. All fake, apparently. She's the one who sent the video to Grandpa. My guess is Westlake wants the property too, but needed Davidson out of the picture first. Blake set down his coffee cup with a shaking hand. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because despite everything, you're still family. And because I think you were manipulated too. Not that it excuses what you did." He stared at the tablet for a long moment. "What happens now?" "Martin is contacting the authorities. There will likely be an investigation into corporate espionage, forged documents, and fraud. I paused. You have decisions to make about how cooperative you want to be. Are you threatening me? A flash of the old Blake surfaced. I'm offering you a chance to get ahead of this, to do the right thing for once. He laughed bitterly. The right thing. Like that's ever worked out for me. It could, if you'd try it. We sat in silence, the cafe bustling around us with tourists and locals enjoying a normal summer morning, oblivious to the drama unfolding at our table. I never meant for things to go this far, Blake finally said, his voice barely audible. It started small, just taking advantage of an opportunity with Vanessa. Then it spiraled. That's usually how these things work, I replied, neither accepting nor rejecting his partial apology. He met my eyes for the first time. What would you do, if you were me? I'd make a clean break, tell the authorities everything, cooperate. Fully. Try to salvage what's left of your relationship with your father. He misses you, Blake. He's disappointed in me. Again. Yes, but he still loves you. Blake nodded slowly, considering my words. I need time to think. Don't take too long. Martin's meeting with the county prosecutor this afternoon. I stood to leave, but Blake caught my wrist. Why did you really come here, Elizabeth? After everything I did? I considered his question carefully. Grandpa would have wanted me to try. He believed there was good in everyone, even when they made terrible choices. He was wrong about me. Maybe. Or maybe you just never gave yourself the chance to prove him right. I left Blake with that thought, walking out into the bright summer morning. Whether he would choose redemption or further self-destruction was up to him now. Back at the cabin, I had a long conversation with Dad and Uncle Richard via conference call, updating them on all I'd discovered. Richard was particularly shaken by the news about Vanessa's true identity. Blake is vulnerable to flattery, he admitted. Always has been. Anyone showing interest in his ideas or ambitions instantly becomes his new best friend. Dad, ever practical, focused on next steps. Martin thinks we have enough evidence to block both Davidson and Westlake from making any legitimate claims on the property. The trust arrangement helps too, multiple layers of protection. By afternoon, events moved quickly. Blake contacted the prosecutor's office voluntarily, providing a full statement about his interactions with Vanessa Caldwell and Davidson Resorts. His attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement that would likely spare him the most serious legal consequences in exchange for testimony against the corporate entities involved. Martin called with the update. Blake's information corroborates everything we suspected. Vanessa approached him initially, knowing his relationship with Howard was distant. She helped him fabricate the text messages and coached him on how to manipulate Howard's trust. When Davidson seemed close to securing the property through Blake's scheme, she recorded their conversation and anonymously sent it to Howard, sabotaging both Blake and Davidson simultaneously. And Westlake would swoop in afterward to pick up the pieces, I concluded. Exactly. They likely assumed the family would be eager to sell after such trauma and deception. Martin's tone brightened. But they all underestimated Howard Patterson and his granddaughter. That evening, I sat on the porch with Grandma's journals and Grandpa's letter, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The cabin was secure. The family, trust would protect it for generations. Blake was taking his first hesitant steps toward accountability. Yet the path to these outcomes had been paved with deception, greed, and manipulation. A car pulled into the driveway, Dad's SUV. He emerged, with a picnic basket and tackle box. "Thought you could use some company," he called as he approached. "And some of your mother's fried chicken." I smiled, genuinely happy to see him. Perfect timing. As we ate on the porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in golden hues, Dad reminisced about his own childhood summers at the cabin. "Your grandfather wasn't always an easy man," he admitted. "Stubborn, set in his ways. But he had an unerring moral compass, knew right from wrong, and stood by his principles, no matter what. I miss him, I said simply. We all do. Dad squeezed my shoulder. But he'd be proud of how you've handled everything. Protecting the cabin, standing up to corporate pressure, even trying to extend an olive branch to Blake. You think that was the right move? With Blake? Dad considered this. I think it was the Howard Patterson move, and that's about the highest compliment I can give. After dinner, we took the old wooden boat out for twilight fishing, a Patterson tradition spanning generations. The lake was calm, reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. In the distance, a loon called to its mate, the sound echoing across. The water. Did I ever tell you about the summer your grandfather taught me to fly fish? Dad asked, casting his line with practiced ease. I was maybe 12, though I knew everything already. As Dad shared stories I'd never heard before, adding new dimensions to my understanding of Grandpa, I felt a deep sense of continuity. The cabin had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. The family had been tested, fractured, and was slowly beginning to heal. Through it all, this place remained a constant, a repository of memories and a promise for the future. Later, as we docked the boat and gathered our modest catch, I noticed a light on in the cabin that we hadn't left. On. Through the window, I could see a figure moving in the kitchen. We have company, I told Dad, nodding toward the window. He squinted in the gathering darkness. Is that Richard? It was indeed. When we entered, we found Uncle Richard unpacking groceries, a bottle of Grandpa's favorite bourbon on the counter, Hope. You don't mind, he said somewhat sheepishly. I bought supplies for a proper Patterson weekend. Steaks for tomorrow, pancake mix for Sunday morning. Oh, and Blake might stop by on Sunday afternoon, if that's okay. Just for an hour or so. He's, taking some steps in the right direction. Dad and I exchanged surprised glances. Then Dad stepped forward and clapped his brother on the shoulder. I'll get the grill cleaned up tomorrow morning. Those steaks had better be prime. I smiled, setting our freshly caught fish on the counter. I'll make Grandpa's special fish fry for breakfast. We have enough for 3. As we settled into an evening of conversation and cautious family reconnection, I felt Grandpa's presence in every corner of the cabin. Not as a ghost, but as a living legacy. In the stories we shared, the traditions we honored, and the bonds we were working to repair. The will that had once divided us was now bringing us back together in unexpected ways. And in the end, that might be the most valuable inheritance of all. 6 months passed quickly. Autumn transformed the lakeside forest into a kaleidoscope of reds and golds before giving way to winter's pristine snowfall. The cabin, now properly winterized with updated insulation and heating, improvements Grandpa had always postponed, served as a weekend retreat even during Michigan's harshest months. December brought news from the prosecutor's office. The investigation into Davidson Resorts and Westlake Development had expanded significantly, revealing a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition tactics throughout the region. Both companies faced serious charges, their executives scrambling to negotiate plea deals. Vanessa Caldwell had been arrested in Arizona, attempting to flee to Mexico. According to Martin, she was now cooperating with authorities, providing evidence against both corporations. Blake's testimony had proven crucial in building the case, earning him immunity from prosecution, a fact that troubled me initially, but that I had come to accept as necessary for the greater good. You're brooding again, Dad observed as we decorated the cabin's Christmas tree, a 7-foot blue spruce we'd selected from the property's northern edge. Just thinking about Blake, I admitted, hanging one of Grandma's hand-painted ornaments, i.e., miniature replica of the cabin itself. He made his choices, Lizzie, and now he's facing the consequences while trying to make amends. That's all any of us can ask. I nodded, reaching for another ornament, a tiny wooden fishing boat Grandpa had carved decades ago. I know. I just wonder if we're doing the right thing, having him here for Christmas. Second chances are part of what family means, Dad replied, untangling a string of lights. Besides, your grandfather always insisted on full family gatherings. For Christmas, it was non-negotiable. He was right, of course. Grandpa had maintained that tradition even through the years when Uncle Richard rarely visited. Christmas is for healing rifts, not widening them, he'd always said. This year would be the first Christmas without him, but it seemed fitting to honor his wishes by bringing the family together, even the parts that were still fractured. 2 days before Christmas, snow fell steadily as I welcomed Emily Winters for coffee. Though no longer professionally involved with the family, she had become a friend in the month since Grandpa's passing. "The cabin looks wonderful," she observed, admiring the decorations. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and evergreen garlands draped the mantel. Howard would have loved seeing it like this. He always went all out for Christmas, I agreed, pouring coffee into Grandma's cherished holiday mugs, ceramic creations painted with cardinals and pine branches, even when it was just the two of us. Emily settled onto the sofa, warming her hands around her mug. "Have you given any more thought to my suggestion? About the foundation?" Since the resolution of the inheritance drama, Emily had been encouraging me to establish an educational foundation in Grandpa's name, something to honor his legacy as both a professor and a conservationist. "Actually, yes. I've been working with Martin on the legal structure. We're going to use a portion of the mineral rights proceeds to fund scholarships for environmental studies students and conservation projects around Lake Charlevoix." Emily beamed. "That's perfect, Elizabeth. Absolutely perfect. We're calling it the Howard and Mary Patterson Legacy Foundation. The first scholarships will be awarded next fall." We chatted for another hour about the foundation plans and local news, before Emily needed to leave for her afternoon appointments. As I walked her to her car, Uncle Richard's SUV pulled into the driveway, followed by a more modest sedan I didn't recognize. Richard emerged, waving cheerfully despite the cold. From the second vehicle, a young woman appeared, petite with auburn hair, bundled in a practical winter coat. "Elizabeth," Richard called. "Hope we're not too early. The weather report mentioned heavier snow tonight, so we decided to get ahead of it." "Not at all," I assured him, curious about his companion. He guided the woman forward through the ankle-deep snow. "This is Dr. Samantha Reeves, a colleague from the university. Sam, this is my niece Elizabeth, the cabin custodian I've told you so much about." "It's wonderful to meet you," Samantha said, extending a gloved hand. "Richard hasn't stopped talking about this place since his visit last summer." I welcomed them inside, helping with their luggage while noting with interest that they'd arrived. In separate vehicles, but clearly together. Richard had mentioned recently that he'd been spending time with a fellow professor, but hadn't elaborated. As they settled in, Richard pulled me aside in the kitchen. "I hope it's all right that I invited Sam. It's all still quite new, but, well, she's important to me." The slight flush on my uncle's cheeks was endearing. At 58, he seemed almost boyishly nervous. "Of course it's all right. The more the merrier, especially at Christmas. Blake knows she's coming," he added. "I wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any discomfort." This consideration, so unlike the Richard I'd known most of my life, was another sign of the changes these past months had wrought in all of us. "How is Blake?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Really?" Richard's expression softened. "Better, I think. The therapy is helping. He's more reflective, less defensive, taking responsibility instead of looking for shortcuts." He sighed. "There's a long road ahead, but he's walking it one step at a time." By evening, the cabin was filled with delicious aromas as Dad and I prepared Grandpa's traditional Christmas Eve beef stew. Samantha proved to be delightful company, intelligent and warm with a quick wit that matched Richard's perfectly. As a marine biology professor, she shared my passion for conservation, offering valuable insights for the Foundation's potential lake protection initiatives. Around 8 o'clock, headlights appeared in the driveway. Blake had arrived. I met him at the door, our first face-to-face encounter since that summer morning at Lakewood Inn. He looked healthier. His face had regained its color, his eyes clearer. "Lizzie," he said tentatively, using my family nickname for the first time in years. "Thank you for having me." "Come in out of the cold," I replied, accepting the bottle of wine he offered. "Everyone's in the living room." The initial moments were awkward, with conversation faltering as Blake greeted his father and met Samantha. Dad, ever the peacemaker, quickly redirected everyone's attention to dinner preparations. "Blake, would you mind setting the table? The good dishes are in the cabinet. By the window, the ones with the pine cone pattern." The simple task seemed to ease the tension. As we moved around the kitchen and dining area, the familiar rhythms of family dinner preparation took over, creating a sense of normalcy that helped bridge the uncomfortable gaps. During dinner, conversation flowed more easily, carefully skirting sensitive topics. Blake spoke briefly about his new job at a small environmental consulting firm in Grand Rapids, a significant departure from his previous corporate ambitions. "It's entry-level," he admitted, "but honest work, and surprisingly interesting." "Consulting. On what exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Helping companies navigate environmental regulations mostly, making sure development projects comply with conservation requirements." A touch of irony colored his voice. "I've become quite familiar with what not to do." After dinner, as Richard and Samantha volunteered to handle dishes, Blake approached me on the porch where I'd stepped out to watch the continuing snowfall. "I've been trying to find the right words for months," he began, his breath visible in the cold air. "Nothing seems adequate." "You don't need—" "I do," he interrupted gently. "I do need to say it. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, for everything. The lies, the manipulation, the attempt to steal your inheritance. It was unforgivable." I studied his face in the porch light, searching for sincerity and finding it. "Grandpa believed in forgiveness," I said finally, "even when it seemed impossible. He was a better man than I'll ever be." "That's not true." I surprised myself with this defense. "You're making different choices now. That's what matters." Blake leaned against the porch railing, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. "Do you remember the summer we both got stranded on the lake? That thunderstorm that came out of nowhere?" "I was 12. You were 14, I recalled. Grandpa was furious that we'd gone out alone." "But not as furious as he was relieved when we made it back," Blake added. "He hugged us both so tight I thought my ribs would crack, then lectured us for an hour about weather patterns and boat safety," I finished with a smile. Blake nodded, his expression distant. "That might have been the last time I really felt connected to this place, to him." He turned to face me. "I let ambition and resentment poison everything. Convinced myself that success meant money, status, all the things that never mattered to Grandpa." "It's never too late to reconnect with what does matter," I offered. He considered this. "Maybe not. But some bridges can't be rebuilt once burned. Think you'd be surprised at how resilient family connections can be." We stood in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the thick flakes swirl in the porch light. When we finally returned inside, the atmosphere had shifted subtly, not completely comfortable, but less strained. Christmas morning arrived with brilliant sunshine reflecting off snow-laden branches. Following Patterson tradition, we gathered in our pajamas around the tree, mugs of hot chocolate in hand as presents were distributed. To my surprise, Blake had brought gifts for everyone, thoughtful ones that showed genuine consideration. For Dad, a rare first edition of his favorite mystery author. For Richard, vintage fishing lures in a hand-carved box. For Samantha, a donation in her name to a marine conservation organization. For me, He'd brought a small, wrapped package that he handed over with evident nervousness. Inside was a delicate silver charm, a miniature cabin that perfectly matched the fish on Grandma's bracelet. "I found it in an antique shop in Grand Rapids," he explained. "The owner said it was part of a set from the 1950s. I thought maybe it belonged with the bracelet Uncle Richard gave you." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught me off guard. "It's perfect, Blake. Thank you." My gift to him, a framed photograph of Blake and Grandpa from that long-ago fishing trip we'd reminisced about, seemed to affect him deeply. He stared at it for a long moment, visibly struggling with emotion. "I'd forgotten what he looked like then," Blake said finally, "before everything got complicated between us." The day unfolded with traditional Patterson Christmas activities: a morning walk along the snow-covered lakeshore, board games by the fire, and preparation of the holiday feast. Unexpectedly, Blake volunteered to help me with Grandpa's famous cranberry sauce recipe, working alongside me in comfortable silence. "I never paid attention to how he made this," Blake admitted, stirring the simmering berries. "It was just something that appeared on the table every year." "He learned it from his mother," I explained, adding orange zest to the mixture. "Who learned it from her mother?" Family recipes were important to him. Another form of legacy. I wish I'd understood that sooner, the importance he placed on these traditions. As the day progressed, the awkwardness that had marked Blake's arrival gradually dissolved. During dinner, Richard proposed a toast. "To Howard," he began, raising his glass, "who somehow managed to bring us together even after he left us." "To Grandpa," I echoed, feeling a familiar tightness in my throat. Blake raised his glass as well. "To second chances," he added quietly. After dinner, as twilight settled over the snow-covered landscape, Dad suggested we revive another Patterson tradition: night sledding on the hill behind the cabin. Bundled in coats, scarves, and hats, we trudged through knee-deep snow, dragging the ancient wooden sleds from the shed. The hill, imposing to childhood eyes but modest in reality, gleamed silver in the moonlight. Dad went first, demonstrating proper technique with exaggerated care that made us all laugh. Samantha followed, her delighted screams echoing across the property as she careened toward the bottom. Richard, initially reluctant, was eventually persuaded. His dignified professor persona completely vanished as he tumbled off halfway down, rolling through the snow like a child. When Blake's turn came, he hesitated at the top, sled in hand. "I haven't done this since I was a kid." "It's like riding a bike," I assured him. "You never forget." "That's what I'm afraid of," he joked. "I was terrible at it back then, too." Nevertheless, he positioned himself on the sled and pushed off, his initial tenseness giving way to exhilaration as he picked up speed. At the bottom, he rolled gracefully into a snowbank, emerging with a genuine laugh I hadn't heard from him in years. I took my turn last, the familiar rush of cold air and speed bringing back a flood of memories, Grandpa standing at the top of the hill, cheering as I conquered my fear. Teenage races with cousins now scattered across the country, college breaks spent recapturing childhood joys. As I reached the bottom, coming to rest near Blake, I was surprised to find tears freezing on my cheeks, not from sadness, but from the bittersweet joy of honoring traditions while creating new memories. "You okay?" Blake asked, noticing my expression in the moonlight. "Yes," I assured him. "Just feeling Grandpa's presence strongly tonight." Blake nodded in understanding. "Me too. It's like he orchestrated all of this somehow." We stayed out until the cold became unbearable, then returned to the cabin for hot cider and Grandma's gingerbread cookies. The evening continued with storytelling, by the fire, each of us contributing memories of Howard Patterson from different perspectives. "He wasn't perfect," Dad acknowledged at one point, "stubborn as they come. But he loved fiercely and forgave completely." "And he knew what mattered," Richard added. Took me decades to learn what he understood instinctively. As the evening wound down, Blake excused himself briefly, returning with an envelope that he placed on the coffee table. I've been debating whether to share this, but it feels right tonight. Inside was a letter from the Lakewood Historical Society, acknowledging Blake's donation to establish the Patterson Cabin Historical Designation Fund. It's not much, he explained, somewhat embarrassed by our surprised expressions. But it's a start. The fund will help preserve historical properties around the lake, preventing development of culturally significant sites. I thought Grandpa would approve. The gesture left me speechless. This thoughtful initiative represented everything the old Blake would have dismissed as sentimental waste, exactly the values he had once mocked. He would more than approve, I finally managed. He would be profoundly touched. Later, after everyone had retired to their rooms, I found myself alone on the porch again, wrapped in Grandpa's old plaid blanket. The night was crystal clear, stars blazing against the black velvet sky in that spectacular display only possible far from city lights. The screen door creaked. Blake, also unable to sleep. "Mind some company?" he asked tentatively. I shifted to make room on the porch swing. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the only sound the distant hooting of an owl. "I keep thinking about what might have happened," Blake finally said. "If my plan had worked, if I'd gotten the property and sold it to Davidson. Best not to dwell on what didn't happen. But I need to," he insisted gently, "to understand what I almost destroyed. This place would be a construction site by now. The trees gone, the shoreline transformed, all for money that wouldn't have made me happy anyway." I had no argument against this truth. "The irony," Blake continued, "is that I'm finding more satisfaction in my modest job now than I ever did chasing corporate success. I'm sleeping better, worrying less about status and more about contribution." "That sounds like something Grandpa would say," Blake smiled faintly. Maybe some of his wisdom finally seeped through my thick skull. Another comfortable silence fell between us before Blake spoke again. "I don't expect us to ever be close, Elizabeth. Too much has happened, but I hope we can at least be family again, in some meaningful way." I considered his words carefully. Grandpa's letter to me said something important. People are more valuable than possessions. He valued family above all else, even when relationships were difficult. Like ours. Like ours, I agreed. But not impossible. Just a work in progress. Blake nodded, seeming to find comfort in this modest but honest assessment. As we continued sitting there, a sudden streak of light crossed the sky, a brilliant meteor burning up in Earth's atmosphere. "Make a wish," Blake said automatically, the childhood reflex still intact. I closed my eyes briefly, not sharing that my wish was already coming true. Family healing, slowly but surely, gathered around the cabin Grandpa had fought so hard to protect. The following day, as everyone prepared to depart, I found myself with mixed emotions. The natural letdown after holidays, combined with renewed hope for our family's future. The cabin would be quiet again, but it had served its purpose as a gathering place, just as Grandpa had always intended. Blake was the last to leave, lingering after helping load Richard and Samantha's cars. "Thank you," he said simply, standing in the doorway, "for giving me a chance I didn't deserve." "That's what family does," I replied. "Or what it should do anyway. I'd like to visit again if that's all right. Maybe help with some of the spring maintenance Grandpa always talked about. I'm pretty handy with a hammer now." "I'd appreciate the help," I said truthfully. "The dock needs rebuilding, and I've been putting it off." As Blake drove away, I stood on the porch watching until his car disappeared down the winding driveway. The snow sparkled in the winter sunlight, pristine and full of possibility. Inside, the cabin was quiet once more, but it felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. Waiting. I walked to Grandpa's chair by the window and picked up the framed photo of him that always sat beside it. Howard Patterson in his fishing vest and lucky cap, proudly displaying a sizable trout, eyes crinkling with joy. "We're going to be okay, Grandpa," I said with a smiling image. "All of us, just like you hoped." And somewhere, perhaps only in my imagination, I heard his familiar chuckle and favorite phrase, "That's the Patterson spirit, Lizzie. That's the legacy that matters." Outside, the lake stretched white and tranquil under its winter blanket, the same lake that had witnessed generations of family stories, some joyful, some painful, all part of our collective history. Come spring, it would thaw and renew itself, just as we were beginning to do. The inheritance Grandpa had ultimately left us wasn't just property or money. It was the understanding that family bonds, though sometimes strained or broken, held the potential for reconciliation and growth. That forgiveness, while never easy, created space for healing. That legacies weren't measured in possessions, but in values passed from one generation to the next. As I moved through the cabin, straightening cushions and gathering stray mugs, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the home that had sheltered so many Patterson memories, for the grandfather who had taught me to fish and to forgive, for the family that was finding its way back to each other, however imperfectly, and for the unexpected truth revealed when Grandpa wrote me out of his will, that what truly mattered couldn't be taken away by lies or legalities. It remained always in the heart, where the most valuable inheritances are kept. 10 years had passed since that fateful reading in Martin Chambers' office. The decade had brought transformations to the Patterson property that even Grandpa, with his forward-thinking vision, might have found surprising, yet satisfying. On a crisp October morning, I stood on the expanded observation deck that now extended from the cabin's western side, surveying all that had been accomplished. The Howard and Mary Patterson Environmental Education Center, housed in the converted boathouse, had welcomed over 5,000 local students in its first 7 years of operation. The conservation trail had expanded to connect with the regional park system, creating a 15-mile protected corridor along the lake's eastern shore. The scholarship program had already sent 17 promising young environmental scientists to college. But perhaps the most meaningful development wasn't visible from where I stood. It existed in the restored relationships and new connections that had formed in the wake of what we now simply called the inheritance situation. My contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek electric vehicle coming up the drive. Blake emerged, now sporting distinguished gray at his temples, despite being only in his early 40s. His transformation from corporate climber to respected conservationist had been complete for years, his earlier misdeeds largely forgotten by the community that now celebrated him as a local champion of sustainable development. "Morning, Lizzie," he called, carrying a cardboard box toward me. "Got something interesting in the mail yesterday. Thought you should see it first." The box contained historical documents recently discovered in the Lakewood County Archives, original surveys of the Patterson property from 1913, along with correspondence between Grandpa's grandfather and local officials regarding water rights and shoreline preservation. "These are incredible," I marveled, carefully examining the brittle papers, protected in archival sleeves. "Perfect additions for the historical display at the Education Center." "That's what I thought," Blake agreed. "But look at this one specifically." He pointed to a letter dated 1921, in which the first Patterson owner of the property outlined his concerns about potential commercial development of the lake. The language was remarkably similar to arguments Grandpa had made in the 1960s and that we ourselves had employed against Davidson Resorts. "Conservation advocacy runs in the bloodline," Blake observed. 4 generations fighting the same battle, in different forms. "Fighting and winning," I added. "So far, at least." We spent the morning cataloging the documents, identifying the most significant pieces for display. Over lunch in the modernized kitchen, Now equipped to handle large family gatherings while maintaining its rustic charm, we discussed upcoming events: the annual Patterson Family Conservation Weekend, the winter solstice celebration, and plans for the Education Center's spring programming. "Have you heard from Vanessa Caldwell recently?" I asked, the question arising naturally from our review of historical conflicts over the property. Blake shook his head. Not since her parole hearing 3 years ago. Her testimony was crucial in the larger corporate fraud case, so she served less time than she might have otherwise. He paused, considering. Strange to think how close she came to succeeding. If she hadn't gotten greedy and double-crossed Davidson, if she hadn't recorded your conversation, if Grandpa hadn't found that evidence. We both fell silent, contemplating the chain of events that had nearly altered the Patterson legacy forever. Blake had long since made his peace with his role in the deception, but occasionally these moments of reflection still brought a shadowed look to his eyes. "Ever wonder how different things would be if I'd succeeded?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes," I admitted. But then I remember something Grandpa wrote in that notebook he left me. The path matters less than the destination, and sometimes the most difficult trails lead to the most magnificent views. Blake smiled at this. He did have a way with metaphors, didn't he? After lunch, we walked the property boundary, checking on recent plantings of native shrubs designed to prevent erosion along the shoreline, a project funded by the Patterson Trust and implemented by local high school students through the Education Center's community service program. "Dad mentioned you've been getting offers again," Blake said as we inspected a row of young elderberry bushes taking root along the water's edge. 3 in the past year, I confirmed. None from major developers. This time, mostly wealthy individuals looking for legacy properties they can pass to their children. Ironic. Exactly. I send them all the same response. "This property already has a legacy, thank you very much." The afternoon brought more visitors. Uncle Richard and Samantha, now semi-retired from academic life but actively involved in marine conservation efforts on both coasts. At 71, Richard retained the intellectual sharpness that had distinguished his academic career, while Samantha, at 68, maintained the practical energy that complemented her husband's more theoretical approach. "You won't believe what just arrived," Samantha announced, her eyes bright with excitement as they settled in the sunroom that had become the cabin's heart during daylight hours. She produced a large envelope containing professional photographs of Patterson Cove taken from underwater, a comprehensive visual survey of the lakebed ecosystem. The university's marine biology department used our cove as their Michigan freshwater study site, she explained proudly. The biodiversity measures are off. The charts compared to similar lakefront areas. Their hypothesis is that our conservation efforts have created a microclimate of exceptional ecological health. We pored over the photographs, vivid images of native fish species, aquatic plants, and the complex underwater topography that made our section of shoreline uniquely valuable as habitat. Detailed scientific notations accompanied each image, documenting observations that would inform future protection efforts. "Grandpa would have treasured these," Richard remarked, adjusting his reading glasses to better examine the technical details. "Remember how he used to speculate about what lived beneath the surface? How he'd make up elaborate stories about lake civilizations when we were kids? Complete with underwater cities and fish monarchies," I recalled, smiling at the memory. He turned ecology lessons into fantasy adventures to keep us interested. "Always teaching, even when we thought we were just being entertained," Blake added. As afternoon transitioned to evening, more family members arrived for the weekend gathering that had become a consistent autumn tradition. My parents, now in their 70s but still remarkably active, brought their famous apple cider and freshly baked bread. Dad immediately gravitated to Mary's Legacy, now a recognized historical watercraft that occasionally appeared in wooden boat exhibitions across the Midwest. Young adults who had been children when the inheritance drama unfolded now arrived with partners and children of their own, the 5th and 6th generations of Pattersons to connect with the lake property. Samantha Jr., now 20, brought several classmates from her environmental science program at Michigan State, eager to show them the education center that had inspired her career choice. Blake's daughter, Olivia, born 3 years after the will reading, raced around with her cousins, their laughter echoing across the property as they engaged in the same timeless activities that had occupied Patterson children for a century. Skipping stones, building driftwood forts, spotting wildlife along the shoreline. Dinner was served. Under cafe lights strung across the expanded deck, the extended family gathered around tables arranged in a horseshoe formation. The meal featured Patterson traditions: fish caught that morning, vegetables from the community garden established on the property's eastern field, recipes passed down through generations alongside contemporary additions that reflected evolving tastes and dietary needs. As twilight descended, conversation naturally turned to storytelling, the oral history that bound the family across time and distance. Younger members requested familiar tales: the great storm of 1976 that had tested the cabin's structural integrity, the summer a black bear visited regularly enough to earn the name Franklin, the famous Patterson fishing tournament of 1992, that ended in hilarious dispute when Uncle Richard's record catch fell back into the lake before it could be officially measured. But this year, 15-year-old Noah, Richard's grandson, asked a question that momentarily hushed the gathering. "Can someone tell us the full story of the inheritance fight? We only know pieces, and the adults always change the subject when it comes up." A weighted silence fell over the assembly. Parents exchanged uncertain glances, gauging whether the time had come for complete transparency about this complicated chapter in family history. Blake broke the silence, his voice steady. "It's a fair question. You're all old enough to understand it now, and it's part of why we're sitting here today." He looked at me, silently asking permission to proceed. I nodded, feeling the rightness of this moment. The younger generation deserved to know the truth, not as scandal or secret, but as a cautionary tale with a redemptive conclusion. For the next hour, Blake and I alternated telling the story, each providing our perspective with unflinching honesty. We detailed the deception, the falsified evidence, the devastating impact on Grandpa during his final months. We explained how corporate interests had attempted to manipulate family divisions for profit, and how truth had eventually emerged through unexpected channels. Most importantly, we emphasized how the crisis had ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed the Patterson legacy, forcing explicit conversations about values that might otherwise have remained implicit, requiring active recommitment to principles that could have been taken for granted. When we finished, another silence fell, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. The younger generation was processing this new understanding of their family's recent history, integrating it with the more straightforward narratives they'd grown up hearing. 16-year-old Emma, Blake's niece, finally spoke. "So that's why we have the trust structure? And why is there so much emphasis on conservation and education?" "Partly," I acknowledged. "Those values were always important to the family, especially to Grandpa Howard. But the inheritance situation clarified their importance and created formal structures to protect them." "And that's why you two work together on everything now?" asked Noah, looking between Blake and me. "Because you had to learn to trust each other again." Blake nodded. "Rebuilding trust takes time and consistent action. Eventually, we discovered we actually make a good team. Different strengths, complementary perspectives. Your grandfather would say we each hold a piece of his legacy," I added. "Blake inherited his conservation vision. I inherited his emotional connection to the property itself. Together, we maintain the whole." As night fully descended, someone suggested lighting the fire pit. Soon a cheerful blaze illuminated the gathering, faces warm in its glow as conversation continued. Questions about the inheritance story, now interspersed with planning for tomorrow's activities and updates on absent family members. When many had retired to various sleeping arrangements around the property, the expanded cabin, the apartment above the education center, small guest cottages built discreetly among the trees. A core group remained around the fire, the principal players in the inheritance drama and their closest relatives. Richard prodded the embers thoughtfully. Sometimes I wonder if Dad somehow knew how this would all unfold. If his final missteps weren't mistakes at all, but a calculated disruption designed to force us to actively choose the legacy rather than passively receive it. That seems far-fetched, my father countered. Dad was wise but not omniscient. He was genuinely deceived, genuinely hurt. But he also left contingencies everywhere, I pointed out. The journal in the hidden compartment, the letter taped behind his fishing license, the safety deposit box with the USB drive. Almost as if he'd created a trail of breadcrumbs in case things went wrong. Or in case they went exactly as he feared they might, Blake suggested. He knew the vulnerabilities in his family relationships. Maybe he wasn't orchestrating events, but he was preparing for possible outcomes. This perspective, that Grandpa's preparations indicated foresight rather than paranoia, offered a comforting reframing of those difficult final months. Not a once-wise man fooled by simple deception, but a complex individual who understood human frailty and prepared accordingly. As we sat watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky, I shared a memory that had recently resurfaced. Remember how Grandpa used to say that a family was like an ecosystem, that each member played a crucial role even when that role wasn't immediately apparent? Nods around the circle confirmed shared recollection of this favorite analogy. He applied ecological principles to everything, Richard recalled. Sustainability, interdependence, adaptation to changing conditions. These weren't just conservation concepts to him, but life philosophies. The diversity-stability hypothesis, Samantha added, the scientist in her emerging. Ecosystems with greater diversity tend to be more resilient to disturbance. Perhaps he saw family the same way, different perspectives creating collective strength. This framework casts the inheritance situation in yet another light, not just as conflict and resolution, but as a system under stress, demonstrating its fundamental resilience. The family had adapted, evolved, and ultimately strengthened through the challenge. The following day brought perfect autumn weather, crisp but sunny, the forest surrounding the cabin ablaze with peak fall colors. After breakfast, the family divided into groups for various activities. Fishing expeditions in Mary's Legacy and the cabin's other boats, hiking along the conservation trail, assisting with educational displays at the center, or simply relaxing on the expanded dock. In late afternoon, everyone reassembled for the weekend centerpiece event, the dedication of the Howard and Mary Patterson Wilderness Observation Tower, a 30-foot structure built at the property's highest point, offering panoramic views of the lake and surrounding forest. Constructed of sustainable materials and designed to minimize environmental impact, the tower represented the latest evolution of the Patterson conservation ethic. Local officials, conservation partners, and neighbors joined the family for this public ceremony. As current trustee, I offered brief remarks about the tower's purpose, providing perspective, both literal and metaphorical, on our relationship with the natural world. From this vantage point, I explained to the gathered crowd. Visitors can observe the mosaic of protected and developed land around the lake. They can see firsthand how conservation choices made by individuals accumulate into significant environmental impact. My grandfather understood that perspective changes perception, and perception influences action. Blake spoke next, outlining educational programming that would utilize the tower, bird migration observation, forest canopy studies, astronomy nights for local schools. His presentation reflected how thoroughly he had embraced the educational aspect of conservation, moving far beyond his initial focus on mere preservation. After the public ceremony concluded and non-family guests departed, we held a private ritual, one that had evolved organically over the past decade. Each family member, from eldest to youngest, climbed the tower carrying a small symbolic item representing their connection to the Patterson legacy. These items, a fishing lure, a polished stone from the shoreline, a pressed wildflower from the conservation trail, were placed in a cedar chest permanently installed at the tower's summit. As twilight approached, only Blake and I remained at the tower, watching the setting sun transform the lake into molten gold. 10 years of collaborative stewardship had created a comfortable partnership between us. Not the easy closeness of lifelong friendship, but something perhaps more valuable. A hard-won mutual respect built on acknowledged mistakes and genuine growth. "I found something at the County Historical Society yesterday," Blake said, producing an old newspaper from his jacket pocket. "Thought you might want to see it." The yellowed clipping from 1943 showed a young Howard Patterson in military uniform, being interviewed about his return to Lakewood after service overseas. The headline read, "Local Soldier Returns, Vows to Preserve What We Fought For." In the brief article, 25-year-old Howard described his determination to protect the natural beauty and community values of his hometown. "When you've seen the destruction of warfare, you understand the preciousness of what remains untouched. Some things must be preserved, not just for our generation, but for all who follow." His conservation ethic began much earlier than we realized, I observed, carefully returning the fragile paper to Blake. War shaped his perspective on preservation. "Makes me wonder what else we don't know about him," Blake mused. "What other experiences formed his values?" "We'll keep discovering pieces of him," I replied. "In archives, in memories shared by people who knew him, in our own growing understanding of what he built here." As darkness settled over the property, lights flickered on in the education center where the younger generation had gathered for an impromptu music session. Guitars, a portable keyboard, and the ancient violin that had belonged to Grandpa Zai, father creating an eclectic but harmonious blend that drifted upward to where we stood. "Different instruments, same melody," Blake observed. "Rather like our family itself." The metaphor was apt. Individual voices finding connection through shared rhythm and purpose, creating something more powerful than any could produce alone. The music rose and fell, sometimes discordant, but always finding its way back to harmony, much like the Patterson family journey itself. Later that night, after most had retired, I sat alone in Grandpa's chair on the porch, wrapped in his old plaid blanket despite the cabin's modern heating system. Some traditions persisted simply because they provided comfort, connection to what came before. From this quiet vantage point, I could see the soft glow of the education center where several young Pattersons continued their music making. The conservation trail was visible as a darker line through moonlit terrain. The observation tower stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. And at the center of it all, the cabin itself, modified, expanded, modernized, yet fundamentally unchanged in its essential purpose as the heart of Patterson family connection. The inheritance that had once seemed so straightforward, a property, passing from one generation to the next, had revealed itself to be infinitely more complex and valuable than mere real estate. It encompassed knowledge accumulated over decades, values tested through conflict, relationships strengthened through reconciliation, and a shared commitment to preserving something larger than individual wants or needs. What Grandpa had ultimately bequeathed wasn't just land and buildings but a living legacy, one that evolved with each generation while maintaining its core integrity. The will that once divided us had become the catalyst for deeper understanding of what truly constituted the Patterson inheritance. Not just what we owned, but who we were together. As lake mist rose in the moonlight, creating ethereal patterns, across the water, I felt profound gratitude for how this story had unfolded, not despite its painful chapters, but because of them. The near loss had illuminated the true value of what we possessed, transforming passive inheritance into active stewardship. "Thank you, Grandpa," I whispered to the night air. "For everything, especially the challenges." and somewhere in that vast connection between water and sky, in the space where memory meets present action and future possibility, I felt his response, not in words, but in the deep certainty that this was exactly the legacy he had hoped to create. Not a perfect family, but a resilient one. Not an unchanging monument to the past, but a living, evolving commitment to values that transcended any single generation. The inheritance story that had begun with betrayal and deception had transformed into something none of us could have anticipated, a foundation for authentic connection and meaningful purpose that would continue long after those who remembered Howard Patterson personally had joined him in memory. And that, perhaps, was the greatest inheritance of all, the understanding that what endures isn't what we possess, but what we nurture, not what we receive, but what we choose to sustain through conscious commitment and daily action. As I finally rose to go inside, the last notes of music faded from the education center. The property settled into nighttime silence, not emptiness, but the rich quiet of a place filled with accumulated meaning, waiting to awaken again to tomorrow's new chapter in the continuing Patterson story. A story that would continue evolving long after all of us were gone. Because we had learned what Grandpa Howard understood all along, that true inheritance isn't measured in acres or assets, but in the values, connections, and commitments we choose to honor and perpetuate through our daily choices. In that profound truth lay the resolution to the inheritance drama that had begun with a devastating revelation in a lawyer's office a decade earlier. The will that had once divided us had ultimately united us in deeper understanding of what truly mattered, and that understanding would continue guiding the Patterson family forward, one generation to the next, as long as the cabin stood watch. Over the lake, Grandpa Howard had loved so well. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.